The box sat open on the dining table, and the room held its breath. It was a small thing, as boxes went. Covered in midnight blue velvet, the kind that cost more than it looked, the kind that announced itself by its silence rather than its shine. Lord Hartmore had placed it at Lady Dorothea Vane's right hand, with the particular care of a man who had rehearsed the gesture and then forgotten he had rehearsed it, so that it arrived looking both deliberate and accidental. 12 people sat at the table, 12 people watched. Lady Dorothea looked at the box. Lady Dorothea was 22 years old and had been the acknowledged ornament of her season, and she had the practiced composure of a woman who had been looked at for a long time. She waited one precise beat before she touched it, because she knew how to let a moment ripen without losing it. And then she opened the clasp and lifted the lid. There were 2 rings inside. That was not supposed to happen. Cecily Wade, standing near the door with her hands folded in the manner of women whose employment required them to be present without appearing to take up space, saw it at once. 2 rings, one large, one small. The large one sat in the velvet's topmost groove, a topaz of the pale orange sort that looked well by candlelight, oval, set in gold, expensive, and assertive. The smaller ring had worked loose from a secondary groove beneath it, perhaps jostled in the jeweler's case, perhaps nudged by the carriage journey, and now lay against the first ring's shoulder as though it had been placed there as a comparison. It was a sapphire, small, dark blue, set in plain silver, the kind of ring that had not been made to impress a room. Lady Dorothea's composure faltered for the duration of a single glance at her mother. Lady Vane, seated across the table, sent back a swift and deliberate look toward the topaz ring, and the matter was decided in the way that most matters in that world were decided, without a word. Cecily looked at the Earl of Hartmore. He was not looking at the box. He was looking at the sapphire ring, and his face was the face of a man watching something that had been locked away for 2 years appear without warning in a room full of people who had never been meant to see it. His jaw did not move. His expression did not visibly change. If you were watching the box, you would have missed it entirely. Cecily was not watching the box. She was watching him the way she had been watching him for 6 months, from the edges of rooms, from doorways, from the particular invisibility of a companion's position, the way you watch a thing you have decided you are not entitled to name. And she saw. There is a moment in certain lives when 2 futures become simultaneously visible and the body understands the choice before the mind has assembled the words for it. For Cecily Wade, standing with her hands folded near the dining room door, at Hartmore Park on the 14th of November, in the year 1814, that moment arrived in the interval between Lady Dorothea's glance at her mother and Lady Dorothea's hand moving toward the topaz ring. She did not speak, not yet. Lady Dorothea lifted the topaz ring from its groove and held it toward the candlelight. It was a fine ring. It caught the light, the way things do, when they are intended to be caught. Lady Vane released a fraction of her held composure. The Dowager Countess, Lord Hartmore's mother, who had sat at the table's far end with the particular stillness of a woman who has arranged everything correctly and is waiting for the arrangement to proceed, permitted herself a small inclination of the head. And then Lady Dorothea said in a voice of polite and genuine curiosity, "What is the other one?" The room went still in a different way. "It is nothing," the Dowager said. Her voice was smooth. It was the voice she used when something required immediate closing. The jeweler made an error in the return of the case. "It is not part of the occasion." Lady Dorothea looked at the sapphire ring. Lady Dorothea had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and the correct choices tended to look at other possibilities the way she was looking at the sapphire now, not with real wanting, but with the instinct to confirm that what she already held was better. "It is rather more unusual," she said. "The sapphire." She looked at the box again, then set the topaz ring on the cloth beside her plate. "The topaz is the ring that was prepared for this occasion," the Dowager said. "And yet there are 2 in the box," Lady Dorothea said pleasantly. She had not replaced the topaz. She had set it on the cloth beside her plate. The Earl of Hartmore had not moved. He sat at the head of the table with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to men who have learned that stillness is a form of governance. Cecily, from the door, saw his right hand close slowly over nothing at his side, and she knew what his right hand was looking for. She crossed the room. She did not ask permission. She was a woman who had not asked permission for anything in 6 months, because no one had thought to check whether the companion had opinions, and she walked to the table and said quietly, "May I see it?" And because no one had thought to stop a companion, no one stopped her. She picked up the sapphire ring from the velvet and held it in her palm under the nearest candle, and she looked at it for one long moment, and then she looked at Lord Hartmore. "This one was not for Lady Dorothea," she said. It was not a question. The silence that followed was of the particular quality that only occurs when a room full of practiced social people encounter a sentence that their practice has not prepared them for. The Earl's gray eyes met hers. Something in them opened, very briefly like a window in a locked house, and then composed itself again. "No," he said. "It was not." Lady Vane's voice came from across the table. "This is not a matter for the companion to address." By then the address had been made. She had been in Lady Fairwood's service for 6 months and 3 weeks. This is how it had come to pass. Her father, a country gentleman of Shropshire, with modest lands and excellent intentions, had died in the spring of the previous year, and the estate had gone to a male cousin who was not unkind, but was also not inclined to provide for a daughter, not his own. Her mother had died when Cecily was 12. She had a small competency enough for lodgings and little more, and she had a thorough education that the world had very limited use for. And she had the habit of composure, which she had developed because the alternative was a kind of grief that had no useful outlet. Lady Fairwood had been a friend of her mother's. She was 71, small and white-haired, and she kept a house near Hartmore Park in Wiltshire, on account of having lived near Hartmore Park for 40 years and having no intention of being moved. Her eyesight had declined. Her mind had not. She had offered Cecily employment in September with the particular briskness of a woman who has recognized a situation and does not see the point in dressing it as charity. To the neighborhood, she was the companion. To the season, she was the companion. When Lady Hartmore had called to assess Lady Fairwood's household upon learning that the autumn dinner would include her companions as additional seats, she had taken one look at Cecily and informed Lady Fairwood's butler, in a voice she did not lower, that she need not concern herself with Miss Wade. "She is merely Lady Fairwood's companion." Lady Fairwood had been in the next room and had heard every word. She had said nothing in the moment, which was not, Cecily had come to understand, the same as not caring. The Earl of Hartmore had arrived at Lady Fairwood's house on the 2nd of October on a matter of estate business, the two properties sharing a long border that required periodic consultation. He had been in the house for approximately 40 minutes. He had spoken to Cecily 3 times. The first time was to ask where Lady Fairwood kept her correspondence, since she was not yet in the room. The second time was to retrieve a letter he had dropped, and which Cecily had picked up before it touched the floor, a transaction requiring perhaps 4 words total. The third time was when he was leaving, and he paused at the door and said without particular inflection, "Lady Fairwood tells me you read Latin." "Well enough," Cecily had said. He had looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she would later learn was his habitual mode, the kind that did not reveal what it was measuring. And then he had left. She had spent the following week being sensible about it. He had a habit she had catalogued without intending to, a gesture the kind men make without knowing they make it, where the right hand moved to the left breast of his coat and pressed once briefly, as though confirming that something was there. He did it when he was thinking of something he had no intention of discussing. He did it when he was required to be present and would have preferred not to be. He did it when the dinner conversation turned to the subject of his future, which it did reliably, whenever his mother was present. She had asked Lady Fairwood about it, in an oblique way, and Lady Fairwood had said, without elaborating, that Lord Hartmore had been married and the marriage had ended badly, and that his mother had been very useful to him in the aftermath, and that sometimes being very useful to a person could leave them less their own than they had been before. Cecily had understood that this was as much as she was going to be told. 2 evenings before the dinner, she had gone to the library at Hartmoor Park on an errand from Lady Fairwood, a volume of correspondence that needed returning, and found it empty of everyone, except the pianoforte, and, after a moment's hesitation, herself. She sat. She was not accomplished in the way the season meant accomplished. She had learned to play from her mother imperfectly, the way you learn things when the teacher loves you but cannot always be there. And what she knew by heart rather than by technique. She played a Scarlatti piece she had never quite mastered, got 12 bars in, stopped, found the passage that had eluded her for 10 years, played it again. She did not hear the door. She played the passage 3 times before she was satisfied, and then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap looking at the keys with the expression of someone who has just resolved a private argument, and then she stood, collected the volume, and turned. Lord Hartmoor was standing in the doorway. He said nothing. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been watching for long enough that he has stopped thinking of himself as watching, and the look on his face was not what she would have called readable. She did not know what to do with it. She said good evening, and he said good evening, and she carried the volume out of the room, and did not let herself think about what it meant that he had watched her choose the difficult thing over the easy substitution 3 times in a row until she got it right. She was the companion. She was practical. She went back to Lady Fairwood's house and pressed her palms flat on the writing table in her small room until the feeling passed. She wore her best gown to the dinner the following night, which was her gray with cream trim at the neck, because it was her best, and because she was not willing, whatever else was true, to be less than herself in that room. Lady Fairwood wore her good pearl earrings. They came in together, companions in the real sense, and Lady Hartmoor's eye moved over both of them, with the efficiency of a woman, cataloguing the room, and found them, in their relative simplicity, adequately placed, which was to say, not disruptive. Before dinner was served, Lady Hartmoor had drawn Lady Vane aside near the window, and Cecily, passing with a glass she was returning to the sideboard, heard her say it with calm certainty. "You need not concern yourself with Miss Wade. She is merely Lady Fairwood's companion." Lady Vane had nodded, incurious, her eyes already returning to her daughter at the center of the room. Cecily set the glass on the sideboard with care and did not look up. The dinner table had been set for 12, and the candles were generous. Lord Hartmoor sat at the head, as was his place, and he directed the conversation with the measured attention of a host who takes the obligation seriously without enjoying it, and for most of the meal the conversation was about the season just closed, the roads, the improvement of Lord Hartmoor's western pasture, and the merits of a particular subscription library in Bath that no one at the table had ever visited. Lady Dorothea sat to the Earl's right. She was charming, in the way that extremely beautiful women who have been charming since childhood are charming fluently and without quite needing to try. The evening assembled itself toward the presentation with the particular momentum of events that have been arranged so carefully by someone that the arrangement becomes its own kind of inevitability. The dessert course was cleared. The Dowager produced a small nod. Lord Hartmoor reached inside his coat. He produced the blue velvet box. He set it at Lady Dorothea's right hand, and then everything that had been arranged so carefully encountered. For the first time, the specific fact of Eleanor's sapphire ring, which had been at the jeweler's for cleaning and resizing, and which the jeweler had returned, as instructed, within the week, and which some assistant had packed into the bottom groove of the returned case without understanding what the case already contained. After Cecily spoke, after the Earl's gray eyes met hers, and he said, "No, it was not," there was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. 5 seconds is a long time in a room of 12 people who have all gone very still. Then Lady Vane said, "I think we had better excuse ourselves," in the tone of a woman performing a graceful withdrawal before the walls come down, and Lady Dorothea put the topaz ring back into the box, with a movement that managed to suggest she had never held it with any particular intention, and both women rose. And the two gentlemen of the party rose with them, and in the shuffling and recovering that followed, the room went from a betrothal dinner to something that had no polite name. The Earl did not speak. He stood at the head of his table, and the velvet box was still open in front of him, and he was looking at Cecily. She was still holding the sapphire ring. She became aware of this at roughly the same moment that Lady Hartmore became aware of it. The dowager's gaze moved from the box to Cecily's hand with an expression that was not yet anger, but was the thing that comes just before anger when you are a person who keeps anger properly governed. Cecily set the ring back into the box. She said in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "I beg your pardon, my lord. It was not my place." "You are quite right," the dowager said, turning from her son to address Cecily with the precision of a woman who has identified the source of disruption and intends to correct it at the root. "It was not." Lord Hartmore said nothing. He closed the box. He carried it from the room. 2 days passed. They were not quiet days, though the house was physically quiet in the way that houses are quiet after something has happened in them. Lady Fairwood's house in particular had the quality of a room after a door has been shut, the air slightly altered, the angles slightly changed. Lady Fairwood herself said very little, which was how Cecily knew she was very upset, because Lady Fairwood's native state was a thoughtful commentary on everything she observed, and her silence was therefore the loudest thing in any room she occupied. What Cecily knew of Eleanor she assembled from the silence. She had known that the Earl had been married. Lady Fairwood had told her, that afternoon in September, that the marriage had ended badly. What Lady Fairwood had not said, and what Cecily pieced together from the residue of 6 months of observation, the gesture of his hand against his chest, the particular way he would not be pressed about the future, the small sapphire ring that had been sent to the jeweler, not to be given away but to be resized for no one in particular. As though the resizing were its own kind of waiting, and Eleanor had died. The child had died. The match had been made quickly, and pressed for urgency, and he had gone along with it, because that is what men of his position do. They go along with the urgency, because the urgency belongs to the whole architecture of the world they were born into. And the thing you should have chosen, at your own pace in your own time, becomes, instead, the thing you chose under pressure in a room full of witnesses. He had not meant to bring Eleanor's ring to that dinner. The jeweler had put it back inside the case without knowing what the case was. For a small accident, the kind of thing that happens every day to people without consequence. This one had consequence. The morning after the dinner, Lady Hartmore came to Lady Fairwood's house. She was admitted to the sitting room before Lady Fairwood was dressed, which was a deliberate choice of timing on the dowager's part, the kind that Cecily recognized as a tactic rather than an accident. She was not in the sitting room herself. She was in the corridor, just outside, carrying a tray that had no particular destination, which was as honest as she was going to be about the fact that she had stayed within earshot. She heard Lady Hartmore's voice, modulated and clear. "Lady Fairwood," she said, "I believe a change of arrangement is required. After last night, I cannot in good conscience leave Miss Wade in a position that has brought her into such contact with my household. We find that her presence at Hartmore Park, however indirect, has been," she paused, choosing her word, "disruptive. I have taken the liberty of writing to Mrs. Hartley Croft, whose household is in some need of a reader and might suit Miss Wade considerably better. The letter has already been sent." There was a pause. Lady Fairwood said very quietly, "You are dismissing my companion, Lady Hartmore," the dowager said. "I am suggesting a reassignment that serves everyone's interests." Lady Fairwood said, "I see." There was another pause, and into that pause, Cecily set the tray down very carefully on a side table and walked to her room, because she had heard enough, and she did not want to hear herself discussed any further in the third person by women who had made up their minds. The letter from Mrs. Hartley Croft arrived the following morning. It was courteous. It expected her by the end of the week. She had no reason to refuse it. It was employment, and it was 20 miles away, and the only distinction between it and this house was that it was not this house. She packed her things in an orderly fashion. She was good at this. She had packed twice in the past 2 years, once when her father died, and once when the cousin arrived with his family in the spring, and she knew which things to put in which order, and she knew the particular numbness that sets in around the third drawer. The way grief and practicality negotiate with each other in the organization of one's possessions. That evening she descended to the hall and set a small wrapped package on the table by the door. Inside was the sapphire ring, which the Earl had left behind in the confusion of the dinner, and which Lady Fairwood had found on the dining table at Hartmoor Park the following morning when she went to retrieve her shawl. She had brought it home wrapped in a handkerchief, meaning to return it, and then forgotten it on her writing table, and Cecily had found it there and picked it up and held it in her palm for rather a long time, long enough to be honest with herself about what it meant to her. She put it in a box. She wrapped the box. She wrote his name on it, Lord Hartmoor, just that, and set it on the table in the hall. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap. Lady Fairwood came in and sat on the small chair by the window. They did not speak for some time. Lady Fairwood had a way of being present in a room that did not require conversation, which was one of the reasons Cecily had come to love her. And so they sat together in the quiet while the fire settled and the evening arrived and the footman's voice reached them from below where he was talking to someone on the step. They heard, through the door, her ladyship says the whole affair was disrupted by the companion's impertinence. The footman was relaying this in the genial way of servants, sharing news without malice, simply cataloguing what the great house had decided about the event. Her ladyship, the companion, the impertinence. Lady Fairwood looked at the fire and said nothing. Cecily said, "It was a fair assessment. Under the circumstances," Lady Fairwood said. "It was not." Cecily looked at her hands. They had held a sapphire ring in a candlelit dining room and said a true thing to a man who needed someone to say it. And now they were folding and unfolding in her lap in a cold room while someone downstairs called her impertinent, and what she felt was very tired. "I am not sorry I spoke," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," said Lady Fairwood. The morning came pale and still. Cecily put on her coat and gloves. She ate breakfast in the kitchen because it was easier than the dining room. She collected her bags and left them by the door. A carriage was coming at 10. She did not look at the hall table. She had said what she meant to say to the package on it, already in her room. In the particular interior voice she kept for things she was not going to say aloud. "I am sorry for your loss. I am glad it existed. I think you know what you want, and I think what you want is not to be managed into it by a room full of people and a box with one ring in it. I wish you well." She went out to the garden and looked at the frost on the grass and counted the days until Mrs. Hartley Croft's household and decided it was manageable. It was always manageable. That was the word that had been applied to her whole life by people who meant it kindly, that she was sensible, she was capable, she was the kind of woman who could be counted on. She had been managed herself so thoroughly that she had become by degrees the sort of person who managed her own grief away before it could become inconvenient to anyone else. She was still standing on the frosted grass when she heard a carriage on the lane. It was not the carriage coming to collect her. It was much earlier than 10. The 3 days between the dinner and Lady Fairwood's at home had passed in a particular kind of suspension, the kind that occurs between one arrangement and the next, when the machinery is already in motion, and the only question is what shape it takes when it arrives. Lady Hartmoor had moved with her characteristic efficiency. She had written to 2 other families of appropriate standing and composed, in her own mind, the narrative of what had occurred at the dinner in terms that would be acceptable to the neighborhood. Lord Hartmoor had gone to his study and stayed there. His secretary had come and gone 3 times. No one had knocked on the study door who was not his secretary. The at-home was Lady Fairwood's, held on alternate Thursdays, which meant that the room it occupied was the same dining room where the dinner had taken place, rearranged now for the easier traffic of an afternoon call. 3 of the usual neighborhood guests had confirmed, plus Lady Vane, who had sent a note, plus a new quantity, a Miss Pemberton, 23, of a family known to the Dowager from a connection in Bath, whom Lady Hartmore had mentioned to 3 people, and who therefore everyone understood to be arriving with a purpose. Lady Fairwood received them in her usual manner, which was gracious and unhurried, and poured tea herself because she always poured tea herself, and made no reference to the dinner, and Cecily stood near the door to the hallway because she was still there. The carriage to Mrs. Gain. Hardley Croft having been redirected at Lady Fairwood's quiet insistence to the following week, and because Lady Fairwood had looked at her over breakfast and said simply, "Stay," in a tone that did not require argument. It was 20 minutes into the at-home when Lord Hartmore arrived. He had not been invited. He had not sent a note. He came in through the front door, which Lady Fairwood's butler opened for him because you do not close doors on earls, and he walked into the drawing-room, and he was still in his riding coat, which no gentleman wore to an at-home, which was therefore a statement of some kind, and he looked at the room with his particular quality of attention, which took in everything without appearing to move, and then he looked at Cecily. She felt the look land in the specific place in the chest where the body keeps what it has told itself it is not, feeling. Lady Hartmore was on her feet. She had the expression of a woman who has arranged an outcome carefully and is watching it be rearranged. She said, "James," with the particular inflection of a mother issuing a direction in the form of a name, Wad. He said, "Good afternoon, Mother." Lady Vane looked at the new young woman. The new young woman looked at her tea. Lady Fairwood looked at her hands folded in her lap, and her face was the careful face of someone who has decided to wait. The Dowager said, "We are in the middle of an occasion. Perhaps the study." She gestured toward the door. "I will not go to the study," he said. "James, I have come," he said with a careful steadiness that was not the same as coldness, "to name the person I intend to marry, since it appears that if I do not do it in a room full of people, someone else will name her for me." The room understood him at once and went very quiet. The Dowager said, "The season is not yet concluded." "Then I name Miss Wade," he said. "She already holds the ring." He said it the way he said everything, in a low and level voice, without performance, without the kind of declaration that a room might later embroider. It was the register of someone who has decided to be precise about the most important thing he has said in 2 years, and therefore has stripped it of everything but what it needs to be. He turned and looked at Cecily. She did not move. She stood near the door to the hallway, where she had positioned herself, as she always positioned herself, at the edge of the room, at the margin, occupying the minimum amount of space that presence required, and she looked at him and thought, "The ring is upstairs." She had not brought it down. She had packed it in her bag when she thought she was leaving, and it was there still, in the smallest front pocket, because she had not been able to bring herself to put it in the parcel after all. She had put a different ring in the parcel. She had put the topaz in the parcel, which Lady Fairwood had pressed into her hands the morning after the dinner, with the information that Lord Hartmore had left it at Lady Fairwood's house at some point during the confusion of that night, and which Cecily had wrapped in paper and labeled Lord Hartmore without looking at it too closely. Because looking at it too closely would have meant thinking about what she had done and what it had cost her, and she had needed to be practical. He was still looking at her. "You sent me the wrong ring," he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, and was entirely him. "I know," she said. The room was watching them with the particular attention of people who have stopped pretending to do anything else. She said, "The other one is upstairs." "I know," he said. Lady Hartmore said, very quietly, "James, you have not considered all of this. I have thought about very little else for 3 days," he said, still looking at Cecily. She told the truth in a room that required her to be quiet, and she told it for my sake and not her own, and she has been here 6 months, and I have been watching her choose the harder thing every time it was offered to her, and I have been managing the conclusions like an idiot, and I am done managing them. The Dowager closed her mouth. It was the particular closing of a mouth that is recalculating rather than conceding. And Cecily knew it would open again. Later, with new arguments. She did not mind. She had been present for the recalculations of women like Lady Hartmore all her life, and she had her own arguments, and she was no longer standing at the door. She had crossed the room. She was in the middle of it, where the candlelight fell, and he was 3 feet in front of her, and the room had the quality of the last measure of the Scarlatti piece, the one she had played 3 times until she found it. Lady Vane rose smoothly and took Miss Pemberton's arm. "I believe," she said, to no one in particular, "that we have another engagement." She moved toward the door with the graceful removal of a woman who has understood the calculation and is performing the correct response to it. And Miss Pemberton went with her, and the 2 gentlemen of the party found reasons to be elsewhere, and Lady Fairwood poured herself another cup of tea and did not look up. Lady Hartmore stood for a moment. She looked at her son. She looked at Cecily with the expression of a woman encountering for the first time the possibility that she does not understand the situation as well as she has believed. It was not a comfortable expression. It was also not the expression of a woman who will refuse to understand indefinitely, because Lady Hartmore was not stupid, and the one thing she had always wanted was her son's survival, and she could see, if she chose to look, what was in his face. She chose to look. She left. She did not say anything, and Cecily understood that as a form of concession that would come back around, in time, in the way that the dowagers of the world always came back around, but that today, it was the best available outcome. The door closed. Lord Hartmore and Cecily stood in the empty middle of the room. Lady Fairwood was at the tea table and appeared to be deeply absorbed in the sugar bowl. He said quietly, "I owe you an apology for what my mother did." "You do not," Cecily said. "She loves you. She is managing you badly, but she loves you." He looked at her for a moment. "You are very precise," he said. "I have been told so." "I mean it as a compliment," he said, and stopped. He said, "I have not been good at this, at the ordinary things. Since Eleanor, I stopped trusting my own judgment." He looked away briefly. "I know," she said. He looked at her sharply. "The ring," she said. "You have had it cleaned twice in 2 years." Lady Fairwood mentioned it once the way she mentions things. "You keep it in your breast pocket. You did not put it in the box for Lady Dorothea. The jeweler put it there because someone in the shop did not know what it was. You were never going to give it away." She paused. "I think you were keeping it because it was the only piece of her you had that was just yours." "That did not belong to the occasion." He was very still. "I am sorry," she said. "That is perhaps more than I should have said." "No," he said. He said it quietly, with the weight of a man choosing a word carefully because the alternative is something much longer. "No, it is exactly right." They stood in the middle of the room, with Lady Fairwood very quietly attending to the sugar bowl, and the fire burning in the hearth, and the frost still white on the garden outside the window. "I should go and get the ring," Cecily said. "Yes," he said. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had catalogued 6 months ago, and never found a name for. She went upstairs, and found it in the front pocket of her smallest bag, wrapped in her handkerchief because she had wrapped it there on the morning she thought she was leaving, and she had not been able to do otherwise, and she sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, with it in her palm. It was Eleanor's ring. It had been Eleanor's, and it had been 2 years in the Earl's breast pocket, and it would always be what it was. A ring for a woman he had loved and lost at speed. It was not nothing. It was a very particular something. She held it for a moment with the gravity that it deserved. Then she went downstairs. He was standing at the window. He turned when she came in, and she held out her hand with the ring in her palm, and he looked at it. And then he reached inside his coat and produced the small velvet box, which he had been carrying since the dinner, which she saw by the slight wear at the edge of the hinge had been opened and closed a number of times in the interim. He opened it. Inside was the topaz ring in its groove, the one meant for Lady Dorothea, ornate and assertive and entirely wrong for anyone in this room. and beside it the empty groove where the sapphire had been. He held it toward her. She looked at the two possibilities, the correct ring, large and golden, and ready for an occasion. The empty groove, which was another kind of offer. She placed Eleanor's sapphire in its groove, and then she picked it back up again without looking at the topaz, and she held it between her thumb and forefinger, and looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "I want to be clear that I understand what this is." "Tell me," he said. "It was hers. It will always have been hers. It is not a replacement, and I do not want it to be one." She paused. "But I think she would have recognized that you needed someone to tell you the truth in a difficult room. And I think she would not have objected to the ring going to someone who tried to do that." Something moved across his face. It was brief. It was the kind of thing that only passes across the faces of people who have been very controlled for a long time. And it passed and composed itself, but she had seen it. "No," he said very quietly. She would not have objected. She put the ring on her finger. It fit. She had not expected it to fit, but the jeweler had been resizing it, and it had been resized to a size that was apparently hers, which she chose to find unsurprising rather than allow herself to think about. He put the box back in his coat pocket. Lady Fairwood looked up from the sugar bowl and said, in a tone of entire composure, "I believe there is cake, if anyone is interested." By Christmas, the neighborhood had accommodated itself to the matter with the speed that neighborhoods always achieve when the relevant earl has been observed to be unequivocal. Lady Hartmore arrived at Hartmore Park for the Christmas season, with a face that had taken on the careful expression of a woman who has adjusted her understanding of a situation and is determined to do so gracefully, and she brought with her a small gift for Cecily that was, in its own way, an apology, a book on Wiltshire Gardens. Inscribed in her thin, precise hand, "For Miss Wade, who understands the value of choosing carefully." Lady Fairwood attended the Christmas dinner. She sat next to Cecily and pressed her hand under the table at one point, and said nothing which said everything. In the library after dinner, when the rest of the house had gone to the drawing room, Cecily sat at the pianoforte. She played the Scarlatti piece. She got through it without stopping. Lord Hartmore stood in the doorway, where he had stood 2 months before, and watched her. She finished. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, the way she always did, looking at the keys. Then he said, "That was the third movement." "Yes," she said. "You could not find the fingering." "The last time I know," she said. "I found it." She turned on the bench and he came into the room. The fire was very warm, and outside the window the snow that had been threatening all day had finally begun to fall. The first snow of the winter coming down white and even on the park. She could see it behind his shoulder. He had his hand at his breast pocket, rebache the habitual gesture, the old one, and then he stopped and looked at his hand and dropped it. "She is here," Cecily said quietly. "She can be here. I do not need her not to be." He sat beside her on the bench. The piano keys ran before them, white and patient. "I know," he said. It was the second time one of them had said those words to the other in the same direction, and it had a different weight each time. This time it had the weight of a door opened, rather than a door closed. She was wearing the sapphire ring. In the firelight it was the color of deep water, the kind of blue that does not perform itself. She had chosen it on purpose. She had known what she was choosing. She had known what the box contained, both possibilities, the expected one and the other one. And she had looked at both of them with the clear-sightedness that had been her best and most inconvenient quality her whole life, and she had chosen the one that was true. The snow fell outside the window of Hartmore Park. The fire settled. The ring on her hand caught the light and gave it back. If you found yourself holding your breath in that dining room alongside Cecily, you are not alone. Leave a word in the comments if you are so inclined, and thank you for staying until the end.